different hierarchies. I'll talk about some theory that influenced my way of thinking, my motivation for doing this, and then the experiments I've run so far. The experiments I've run so far have been relatively recent, so I still don't have all the results in. Okay, so first off, Holland's objectives, and please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, are to uncover the mechanisms that generate development, that generate hierarchies and complex systems, and then to use this knowledge to help steer CIS, the modification of signals and boundaries. There's like a large quote beneath that kind of says it in more detail, but the basic, what this book is trying to get at is to understand why and how do hierarchies develop, and what can studying signals and boundaries tell us about that evolutionary process. Okay, so what is the role of signals and boundaries? The most important things to know are that boundaries define agents and the aggregation of agents. In general, a complex data system consists of multiple interacting agents, and these agents can be aggregated. An agent is defined by its outer boundary, and that determines what sorts of interactions can take place inside the cell. Activities can take place inside the boundary. Signals are the means of agent-to-agent interaction, agent-to-environment interaction. And then these boundaries filter the signals. And these boundaries are semi-permeable, permitting easy passage for some, and it's more difficult for others to enter. And I'm going to talk about a few examples down here. So the first example is, I'm going to quickly talk about market examples. So it's pretty easy to see that there are multiple sorts of signals in the environment. You have like buy and sell orders for IBM, buy and sell orders for Yahoo, for like cattle, for a billion different markets going on at once. And you would think of agents as individual founded traders, individual agents that have boundaries, and say when there's like IBM sell orders floating around, they might pick up an IBM sell order and then act on that, for example. And then the other probably most important one to know, is I'm going to probably reference it a lot, is the analogy to a biological cell, which Holland references numerous times in the book, and that's like seems to be a lot of the inspiration for this work. Basically, you think of biological cells having like an outer boundary, and then it permits the passage of some proteins, some signals inside, which can then be further refined by, say, the mitochondria or other internal agents. And so I'll reference that throughout the course of this. So there are a couple key interaction categories that are covered in the book. There's three that I'm most interested in, because I think brokers somehow relate to these three topics, which I'm mentioning now. Is hierarchy, recirculation, and diversity. Hierarchy, we discussed kind of very briefly, I'm not going to go over that again. Recirculation comes about when agents convert resources and then pass them on to be later recycled. Diversity has to do with different agents exploiting different strategies, and that gives way to like different signals and boundaries in the system. And diversity is a feature, as a result of combining building blocks in different ways, new ways. I will say this again, if you want to have like a way more in-depth explanation of what all this is, I would recommend just reading this book. This is like a very, very, very high level what is going on.
I represent that too.
Okay, so he suggests using class a couple modeling concepts in order to like computationally test and like get at what is going on with signal and boundary systems. The three that I use for the purpose of my research are classifier system tags and tag nerds. There's also a Janus algorithm and a couple other components, but those are the three that I use because I'm not studying the evolution of brokers, I'm just studying it at a certain set of time. So these are the parts that were implemented. So a classifier system is used for defining signal processing programs, such as like the agent's entry and exit conditions, and also the reactions that will take place. Tags are used for directing signals, and then tags are also used to define the semi-permeable boundaries of the entry and exit conditions. I'm going to explain what all this is in a second. I'm going to go through each one just so that we're quickly on the same page. So a classifier system, a CAS can be defined in terms of a set of signal processing rules called classifier rules. Each rule accepts certain signals as inputs, and then processes the signals to produce certain outputs. This consists of a list of signals and a list of reactants. The signals are represented as binary strings, or the output at 1, 0. Individual rules in the system, called classifiers, take the form if signal, like say, 1001 is present and signal 1111 is present, then send this signal, say, 1011. And then tags and taggers. This is other modeling concepts that are used to I'll explain how this all ties together, but these are just the basic concepts that need to be understood. Tags, they're small segments of the string. And tag-sensitive rules, conditions can be specified using a 3-letter alphabet, 1, 0, and a hashtag, where the hashtag is like an I don't care symbol. So if you look, how does this make sense? So if you look over on the right, there's a tagger. You can see that there's a ball, the black ball at the very top. It's 11011. Let's say it's trying to diffuse into this urn. You can see that there's an entry condition 11 hashtag. The ball satisfies that hashtag because it meets the tag 11 satisfies the entry condition rule 11 hashtag, so it's allowed to enter the urn. So that's how you combine tags and urns. You give the entry conditions, exit conditions, tags with which the signals must match in order to enter or exit. Okay, and then so briefly, signal reactions are based on billiard ball dynamics from particle physics, and you're able to achieve this by using the classifier rules and imposing a requirement that there's a conservation of elements. So basically, the basic idea is different signals are defined as different colors of billiard balls, and when they interact, they change the colors of the products of the reaction in this model. And so you could have signal with a certain tag, interact with a signal with a certain tag, produce two different signals with a certain set of tags. Okay, and so, yeah.
I guess, as some motivation, it seems like a way to specify how agents interact. But what I'm wondering is, you specify all these processes. What are examples of processes that aren't these things? Right, so what would be a not billiard balls example of signal processing, kind of around the example? Because I feel like you're throwing a lot of mechanisms, but I don't have a complete idea what is and what is not. Or what kind of restrictions or mechanism choices.
That's a good question. So in the second half of this, well, part of my research right now is trying to figure out when does the billiard ball dynamics actually I don't have a good answer for you. I don't have a good answer for you right now. And that's going to take that explain 30 seconds. I think I'll move on, and I'll come back to that. Because I think I do understand what you're saying but I think it's ancillary to where I'm going. Okay, so here we have here's some examples of the actual structure of the taggers. So one is a higher level urn, and it takes in it can take in signals with this corresponding tag, and then a reaction happens on the outside, and then it lets it exit. It has that following exit condition tag, and then it can diffuse down a level into a lower level urn if the signal matches this tag, and then it can keep going. So tags basically define the relationship between urns. You can produce hierarchies. Yep.
What makes reactions happen?
What makes reactions happen?
Yeah.
Reactions happen. You just basically. I'm going to get to that in a second. I'm just trying to define the actual structure of the urns, and then I go through the diffusion and reaction processes.
A quick answer is when two balls collide, then you get a reaction. So this is what is usually called billiard ball chemistry.
But I guess I'm just trying to understand, is it with probability one, or is it with the energy of the system?
No, you have a probability. When two balls collide, then the probability that the reaction takes place is what's called the forward reaction rate.
I'm clear about that. I guess if you go back to the collision theory, it's energy which they collide, and that's part of what determines that probability. I'd like to know if that's kind of part of what you have there. Because I think she raised earlier the question that she's trying to figure out kind of conditions on that, which some things happen. And I guess we know that the density of the world in which this thing exists may be kind of critical. So if you're creating a world in which there is 2 traders and only this large, reactions can happen the same because you're the same size with this number of potential reactants. So I'm just trying to understand where we're going with this.
Well, again, think of having a long list of possible reactions.
Yeah.
And then you have, when 2 balls collide, there's a certain probability that the reaction will take place. That probability determines the forward reaction.
So we discussed things. We just discussed reactions for a second. Now I'm going to discuss diffusion. The way diffusion works is meant to resemble how diffusion works in a biological cell. So what happens is, so let's say you're a reactant T and you're trying to diffuse down level. So you're in the cytoplasm of the biological cell and you're trying to diffuse the mitochondria. All you have to look at is, do I satisfy the entry condition of the urn I'm trying to diffuse into? And let's say you're reactant C in the cytoplasm, you're trying to diffuse outside of the cell. All you have to look at is your parent level, your parent urn, and say, hey, do I satisfy the exit condition of the urn I'm trying to diffuse out of? And that allows you to get diffusion that's similar, if not the same, as that which occurs in biological cells, which is pretty neat. Okay, so Graham and I built a Python platform which implements most of the Symbols and Boundaries book. So he's here today, and at some point we'd like to make this available for everyone to use if they wanted to do experiments on it as well. The basic programming classes are signals, constructed from the alphabet 10 reaction, which is a list of reactions, and the respective background for reaction rates. Conditions, and that's constructed from the alphabet 10 hashtag. The conditions are used primarily to build the urns. And the urns are implemented with those n-mixed rules and a signal ability, and a signal reservoir. So it tells you what the n-mixtions are and then what balls are within the urn. And then there's an urn stack which tells you who the parent of the urn is and who's the child of the parent, child of the urn, given urn. Yep, and then the other main class is the go method, which is where the reaction diffusion steps occur.
Well, Boston subordinate there would
parent and child.
So Boston subordinate would subordinate would correspond to an interior urn, if you're inside the cell, mitochondria is the subordinate. Right? If it's outside, that's boss. That terminology doesn't.
Yeah, sorry, I should be up here with this. Okay, so let's quickly discuss the reaction and diffusion dynamics. So the diffusion dynamics are, I pick a ball at random, I find out what urn it's in, and then I pick a destination using that urn diffusion method, using the cell diffusion method. So if I'm trying to go out, I look at the exit, I look at, and then you check where the urn is in the urn stack, you randomly select one of its balls. If the destination is blocked, check the signal that satisfies, check if the signal satisfies the exit condition of the urn. If the destination is subordinate, check if the signal satisfies the entry condition of the subordinate. If the destination is valid, you are allowed to move the ball. And then for the reaction dynamics, you pick a ball at random, you find out what urn it's in, you select the second ball from that same urn, and check if there are any reaction rules for which the balls are appropriate reactants from the reaction list. That's defined at the beginning of the experiment. And if so, you apply the reaction and return the results products to the urn. So you remove those balls and you put in new balls that are the products of that reaction. And so a few notes is that there may be many diffusion steps for each reaction step. You could have 1,000 reaction steps for every 10 diffusion steps. You can flip it vice versa. It doesn't matter. And then it's also it's better to pick a ball at random than an urn at random for the diffusion, so that the diffusion and reaction are skewed to regions of higher density. And that's just a small side note. It doesn't really
We built the Python platform to facilitate her thesis work, but I'm happy to, if there's interest, I'm happy to do a demo of it if other people think that they're interested in using the platform for their own. So that's the point of it. It's great something to be used by. Anyway.
Okay, so I would like to move on to the actual working pieces, which is the think about how do brokers contribute to what we see in single buying systems and how might I was going to say. Sorry, I got nervous. Okay, so while I was reading single environments, I was also reading some work by Ronald Westbrook, a sociologist, and he talked a lot about. I'm going to read full quotes to get you to help you see kind of understand where I was coming from. So holes between two social structures creates an opportunity to broker the flow of information or technologies between people and control the projects that bring people together from opposite sides of the whole, having access to more information. Brokers are able to tailor solutions, and the benefits lead to faster and better solutions, cost reductions, etc. And then another thing is that the gains from a broker can be expected to disappear as more brokers become a bridge between the two groups. So as we add additional brokers, the advantage of bridging the whole decreases as the whole disappears. So I found that to be really interesting, and that got me thinking about agents that sit between two similar boundary hierarchies. Because the majority of Colin's book, most examples are really just I didn't really see anything talking about agents sitting between hierarchies and mediating interaction between two different groups. So I started to wonder what would happen if you put an agent between two hierarchies and how that might facilitate diffusion of signals.
So just,
yeah.
Chris, just for my clarification. So,
yeah.
What's the role of a broker for BERT? What kind of functional, real world role does it play?
A broker for BERT is someone that introduces ideas, technologies, people from say one social group to another.
Okay.
And so it's very much in a social context. And so I'm going to move on to other examples in a second. The second book I was reading around the same time was a book by John Levy Martin, which is wonderful. It's on the evolution of social structures by a sociologist in Chicago. And he was talking a lot about how he's one of the first people to really try to take a stab at thinking about how social networks evolve in a network theory way, which I enjoyed reading. He actually talked a lot about how brokerage is one of the key changes in a social network towards something that's larger, like a multi-hub structure, and larger, more complex hierarchies when they agglomerate. So when you bring two hierarchies together, he thinks it's a key role that brings hierarchies together. So just reading those two books kind of back to back and also recent environments got me thinking about their role in making hierarchies. So some examples of brokers that are different than the social context. So the first one is that think of them in markets. The brokers match individuals with goods and services that are willing to buy and sell from each other and doing so acting on behalf of themselves or others. You think like real estate brokers or stock brokers. In a social context, we discussed this with BERT. You can think of a matchmaker, for example. In the monetary system, this is where it becomes a little more abstract. You can think of a bank as a broker connecting individuals or institutions and transferring money between them. In a political context, which BERT talks a lot, which John Levy Martin talks a lot about how local governments as a whole function as a broker between the community and the regional government, for example. And then you can think about even more specific examples like the auto industry. I think of within the auto industry, you can think of a scrap metal yard as brokering degraded metal and transferring it to smelters, which can be used to recycle the degraded products. So for me, I would say a broker is a more abstract concept than just something in a social context for me, and that's how I'm using it in here. So the question is, why model brokers? So as noted before, it's Holland's objectives to understand the mechanisms that underpin the development of hierarchies. And questions, he says that questions about agents are a good starting point. And another thing he asks is how do agents aggregate into hierarchical organization, and how do agents form and redirect flows of signals and resources? And I kind of think that brokers might be a mechanism, and that's what my experiments are trying to show, is that they can facilitate hierarchy development by enabling communication and resource transference between separate agents that may or may not know each other, and setting the stage for eventual aggregation. They can facilitate diversity, which is one of the interaction categories we talked about at the very beginning, by solving coordination problems that would otherwise discourage agent specialization. So as agents become more and more specialized, it might be harder to send signals back and forth if there are many diffusion steps that they must go through. And then Brokers can also facilitate recycling and recirculation of resources by creating more efficient channels for resource flow, which is, yes.
Oh, so would like a biological example maybe be red blood cells or even a molecular level like hemoglobin or something that's kind of allowed to go to different places in the system to pick up one resource and then put it somewhere.
Yeah, I would think that, yeah, that makes sense to me. It is allowed to be multiple hierarchies without real restriction. Okay, so I think
There's a good relation between this and Mark Newman's idea of communities in networks. So you could make some comparisons on that.
I believe that, so this is me for myself, is that I believe that brokers and stolen brine systems are conceptual complements. So brokers help to explain many properties of SMB systems Holland proposes, and Holland's SMB framework provides a means of rigorously modeling broker behavior, which is different than what social scientists have. It's a more rigorous means of seeing the direct influence of putting a broker between two hierarchies on the flow of signals. And as again, I want to say that John Holland in his book, Signals and Boundaries, provides a way to model the evolution of signal and boundary systems. I'm not as concerned with the evolution of brokers, but if you would like to look into that, I think you could use his framework, I think, to actually develop a broker and from signals and from building blocks. But I'm just going to link to the fact that there is a broker and seeing its influence. Okay, so here's like the big key idea behind the thesis, I would say. Okay, so we're going to look at the left side first. So X and Y represent two different separate signal and boundary hierarchies. Okay. The goal is to get a product that is made in X to inside of Y, so that a new product can happen. So that's all. That's the goal. So you can see there's just one earn level. It takes two diffusion steps to get from X to Y. So it has to diffuse out X into Y, 1, 2. If you increase the number of earn levels, in order to get from X to Y, it has to diffuse one side of X into like its parent earn, and then another time, so 1, 2, and then it's in the environment now. It has to diffuse 2 more steps to get into Y. So it's 4 diffusion steps. If you increase it to 3, you have 6 diffusion steps. If you increase it to 4, you have 8 diffusion steps. Does everyone follow? So you have to keep diffusing out into the environment and then into the other earn in order to get there. And as you increase the number of levels, it increases the number of diffusion steps you must do in order to get there. So now take the case where there's a broker between the two hierarchies. If it's just one level, you add a broker, it actually decreases the efficiency because now you have to diffuse out of the first earn into the broker, out of the broker into the second, to the Y earn. But as you increase the number of levels, you can see that it becomes more efficient. Now you can go directly from the X earn into the broker into Y, and it's skipping all these steps. So you can see that there's gains to brokerage as the number of levels increase. Yes?
So this is like kind of a conceptual question,
Yeah.
but I mean, and you don't need to have an answer for it. Though if you do, that'd be really cool. But what, right, so why wouldn't we just imagine that the two systems would try to integrate with one another, or that they would that they would just incorporate with one another? So what is it about the system that needs to maintain the kind of integrity of each of these hierarchies distinctively that doesn't allow them to actually intermingle?
You can think, so I think that's a great question. There's nothing that says these two hierarchies can't aggregate, but in the process of joining together, there's some point at which one agent's going to need to be in both hierarchies. Or the hierarchies have to develop, envelop. I think of it as more like a process to getting to that merging.
Yeah, I'm not really pushing back in any way. I'm just saying I think that in there are certain systems where you might you could have two firms, right, that a supplier and a producer, and they might decide there are synergistic reasons to combine, and then the hierarchies will merge together. And then, in which case you don't need a broker because the hierarchies are going to merge. But then there are going to be some classes of systems where it's more efficient, for whatever reason, to maintain parallel hierarchies. And those are the systems
spatial or something.
and those are the systems that you're interested in. And so I just like you to think like in the long run, about what is it about that make the distinctive about those classes of systems that require distinctive hierarchical structures.
I keep interrupting, but
No, that's fine, John. Your interruptions are wonderful.
Go back to Adam Smith.
Okay, I like Adam Smith. I like going back to him.
And now what you've got is you've got, say, 3 producers just working side by side versus 3 producers, each of which is a specialist. And what Smith shows is that, in fact, the output of the system goes up by a factor of 10 under the latter arrangement if you have specialists. And so it's important to think about Smith's example, as old as it is, because it really makes clear why you have specialists.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good kind of toy example to think through, to kind of construct a kind of conditions under which account as to like why you would imagine that you're going to have these like distinctive and parallel hierarchies. But anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in on the point, so to put the argument together, I think it would be that having the hierarchy allows you to do specialization, but sort of the cost of doing that is now single transference becomes more complicated to hierarchies. So by putting the broker in, you kind of solve the single transference problem. So now you get the benefit of specialization, but you're also able to solve the single transference problem.
That's great,
And that was alluded to earlier. Okay, and then here's the general case of what I just described. And the most important takeaway is that brokers become more important the deeper the hierarchy is. Is everyone okay? Okay, so my 3 big hypotheses that I'm going to test are, first, hierarchy connected with a broker significantly outperforms hierarchy without a broker and achieving a target reaction that requires both hierarchies, requires products of both hierarchies, or, the last part is not necessary. Gains due to brokerage increase as the environment becomes noisier, and I'll show you what I mean in a bit. And then adding a second broker between 2 hierarchies results in further gains but at a decreasing rate, indicating a steady state number of brokers. So as you add brokers to the system, the value of each one decreases. So here are the experiments. So here's a little bit of a preamble. So one of the key arguments in Holland's model is that boundaries instantiated as specialist errands increase reactivity. And this occurs because errands create select pools by allowing only the reactants that can interact within them, relevant to particular subset of reactions, thereby increasing the concentrations of those reactants and probability of the reaction occurring. And then there are some quotes at the bottom that I basically just summarized. Okay, so there are probably reaction models that don't do well with the addition of errands. But that's one hypothesis that Scott Page and I have talked about. I've actually yet to find, we've yet to come across one that actually shows that. That I can model with this. But for the For the purpose of testing brokers, it's important to use reactions that you know increase reactivity with additional earn levels, because you want to be comparing the effect of a broker on 2 hierarchies that have their reactivity increased by the addition of earns, rather than testing something that's not. I want to make sure that I'm isolating the effect, basically. So I have this sort of this reaction dynamic that seems complex, but it's not so bad. I'm going to explain how it works on the next page. But what it's getting at is it's making sure that only reactants that have had a similar number, the same number of reactions that occurred previously are allowed to interact. So the basic thing is, I'm just going to walk through it verbally. So basically, so you have 2 reactants, AAB and ABA. 2 reactants are allowed to interact if they match in the first bit. So they both have A's as the first bit, and so they're allowed to interact. And how they interact is they go until their first disagreement. So here it's A and B, and you make everything before that a C. And then once the reactants have C's in them, you go, okay, how many C's do you have? Do you have the same number of C's? Yeah, they both have 1 C, so they're allowed to interact again. And they make the next non-C, they turn it to a C. and you do it again where you go, okay, how many C's do you have? Oh, we both have 2 C's, you let it interact. Okay, turn those two, make the next non-C into a C, and you end up getting CCC and CCC, which is the target product of the reactions. And so basically what this is doing is the reactions, the C represent how many reactions have occurred. You can think about this in terms of, you can think about this in two ways. You can think of like, each of these reactions is like a fine grained reaction, which is equivalent to like one of John Holland's like billiard ball reactions. Or you can think about it as like, when you course grade it, you can think about like A, B, and A, B, A becoming CCC and CCC. And so, and you can see down here, like how hierarchy would improve reactivity under this reaction model. Basically, the additional ergs isolate reactants with the same number of C's. So it basically creates pools, but only interact with the same number of C's can interact. So you're not picking up like a C and a CC and then finding out, hey, you guys can't actually interact because you have the same number of C's. And so if you apply, if you apply that reaction, on the right is like the complete reaction list, all the unique reaction pairs that would happen under this model if you have reactants of like 3, starting with like all unique products of A and B. So you can see that it's rather cumbersome. And so I did this for reactions of C. I also do this again for D. So basically, I'm building up a scenario in which you have reactions that can only occur in one hierarchy and reactions that only occur in another hierarchy, C's and D's, and then I'm making the product of the C hierarchy combined with the product of the D hierarchy to make GGG. And so this is just showing that both sets are reactionless. So the additional reaction I add on here is that if you select CCC, which is the product of the C reaction list, and D to B, which is the product of the D reaction list, then they combine to make GGG, which is the target reaction. Okay, so here is like the structure of this experiment. So you start with two erg hierarchies situated in a journal list, and you start with all products of A and B of reactant like 3 in the environment. And you apply the reaction rule, and when they have a C, when it has like one C is allowed to enter here, you can slowly have a reaction occur and diffuse the reaction diffuse. You can see that one CCC is made in this urn. It has 2 pathway options to get to this urn in order to combine and make GGG. The 2 pathway options are it can diffuse out into the generalist urn and then back over into the D hierarchy down into the innermost urn in order to make GGG. And just to like trigger your memory, this is basically sort of like testing this idea. Okay. So there are 2 pathway options. You can either go diffuse out the hierarchy, out the C hierarchy into the D hierarchy, or it can go directly into the broker. So you can see it cuts down the diffusion steps. Okay. So this is like in the past week. So I haven't. I totally do a larger parameters week. But you can see this is without a broker. This is with a broker. This is for reactant 3. The most important thing is the average amount made of GGG. And you can see that with the broker increases by like around 10 or so reactants, which is not that much. It doesn't seem like a major increase, but it is increased. What's interesting though is the efficiency with which this is done. So adding in a broker gives you an efficiency gain. You get all the end product faster, but it's not showing us conclusively that more of the target product is created. One way, it's important to know that I'm not pumping in additional initial reactants. I'm just starting with like a set number of initial reactants that can only convert into like so many GGGs. If I was to like keep pumping in initial reactants, the advantage of a broker might be more easily demonstrated because it would just keep having the it would be more easy to demonstrate that like there's an advantage for having a broker between the 2. Yes.
I think to dovetail off that, if you could have some simulation in which the pumping in was time varying, then I think with a brokerage system, you would see more responsiveness to that kind of time variation, right? So that if the input flow is up and down, right, if the pathway is shorter, then your GGG creation should vary up and down with the input, right? Whereas if you're just diffusing very slowly, there's going to be a very lagged and likely very muted reaction. Because in some sense, I'm going to surprise that there is a difference, right?
What you are or not?
That like after a lot of steps that there is even any difference, right? Because it's like with enough time, enough probability.
Yeah, with enough time, you would expect that without a broker would eventually do the same thing. But the difference is the rate at which it's done. So I see what you're saying in additional way.
You can't be what we call like an impulse response, right? Has something spike.
That's an interesting thought. Okay, so the second model I did was I wanted to see what would happen if you put garbage in the environment, because often it's not just the signals that you want in the environment, it's the signals that you don't want. You're like trying to sift through and figure. There's often things that you don't want to put on the environment, so you start with everything's the same except for you start with some amount of garbage in the system. And my hypothesis was that the value broker would increase with the amount of garbage, and this is like the signal to noise ratio in the system. And so this I just did this morning, so I don't have like a huge sweep. Unfortunately, I just have one. This is this morning. There was an increase, there was an increase relative to, so first off I started with half of the initial reactants were garbage. So it was 300 reactants that were useful to the end product, 300 that were not useful for the end product. And on the left side you have the scenario where there's not a broker, and at the end, at the end of 10,000 steps, it only achieved 126 GGGs. And at the end, for the case where there was a broker, at the end of 10,000 steps, you can see that it achieved 178 reactants. So I need to obviously do a sweep of that, but that was just the one I did this morning. I've done a similar experiment under a different scenario where it has increased, like the value of the broker has increased with garbage. More garbage in the environment, so I feel somewhat confident in saying, like showing that we've done it with different scenarios, but not with that reaction rule. Anyways, so here's some like the big takeaways from this project, which I hope to under course grading, brokers appear to be catalysts. I think brokers are not catalysts. You don't see that brokers aren't catalysts of the individual reactions. What you're looking at is a particular reaction equation, and there's no catalyst in it. But if you zoom out a step and you consider like the compartmentalization of reaction process, how much product has been generated, you see that brokers are actually increasing the rate at which the product is being made from the reactants. And that might be better demonstrated with, say, continuous input of initial reactants into the system. And so there's like a possible information theory interpretation, which I'll modestly suggest. Brokers might be a direct mechanism for transferring signals in the environments with noise. And then lastly, I got really interested in the concept of if there's garbage in your environment, how do you clear out garbage? So if you don't have a broker, what are other agents you can put in? And one idea was to have like a garbage agent that would encapsulate the garbage. And then it acts as a garbage collector agent. And this agent essentially acts.
You sell it as ethanol.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've also been toying around adding different agents into the system and seeing how those improve the end product being achieved. Anyway, that is all I have. And I'm like, oh, I'm good. Okay. I will take questions. I'm still working on the results, obviously. So, questions, maybe.
I was worried if on your team there was any kind of like the actual like background structural probability stuff, because with the way that you're describing it, it sounds like you can model the transition probability just like a Markov process, right? Because you only depend on the current state. And I think in the future when you like actually like introduce this model, it might be helpful to kind of say that as a restriction, because at least my impression was when you named all the things at the beginning, I didn't have a very clear idea of like what the restriction on the model was, right? Like we say things like agents interact and communicate, but what's the restriction under your certain model of urns, chambers, tags, right? And this kind of Markov like condition is a very sensible one, right? Because it's, well, not I don't know if it's sensible, but because I don't know the literature. But like it's like it defines your model, right? It like defines this communication process.
A key point there is that the Markov matrix is sparse.
Right.
And that
Yes.
makes a lot of difference
Yes.
in the way you look at these.
And then if you have that language, then what you're basically saying is the effect of a broker is just basically changing in this very big sparse matrix. I add a single 1 in place of a 0.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's very different dynamic. And I feel like that might be a good way to sell it, right? Like in this gigantic matrix, I just changed one number.
Okay.
And then, because like on that note, I feel like it might make some of the arguments for why like the steady states are the same, but like the transition process is like different, like a bit cleaner.
Okay.
And then I think like it, and like that would make things like impulse response things like you're just gonna talk about, right? Because then you have kind of like a background structure in your mind instead of just the program is kind of doing it from the background.
Okay.
Let me inject 2 comments here. One's just sort of keep. How tall do you think Darwin was?
How tall do I think what?
Do you think Darwin was? How tall was Darwin?
5'4".
5'4". 5'5".
He was over 6 feet tall, and in order to sleep in his cabin, he had to remove some of the books from the shelf at the end so his feet could go in where the books were. It's, not many people think of him as being a really tall man. The other thing is, people say that you can't, evolution is interesting, but you can't make predictions with it. But in fact, Darwin looked at an orchid called the comet orchid because it had a really long stem. And he knew these orchids of this kind were pollinated by moths. And so he said there had to be a moth with a tongue that long. And it was only about 15 years ago that they finally photographed that moth. So that kind of high specialization, you have to ask yourself, why does it come about? Why does it persist? That kind of thing is a really important question when you're looking at these things. And then the kind of thing you were saying, if you've got a very sparse matrix, then if you're only changing one ball at a time, then first of all, they're very fast algorithms for sparse matrices. It also gives you a better, I think, understanding.
And then I think in terms of like other ways to pitch this, right, is that like you can view your ERN network as a graph, right? And then like another way of like saying this brokerage is like by adding one more edge on my relatively sparse graph, right? Then I like change very fundamental properties of the graph, right? Between this changes some eigenvalues change in a very dramatic fashion. I feel like it's the way you presented it is highly abstract, and like I think it would help a lot if we had those kinds of concrete representations, and even if you don't want to do concrete real world, like concrete mathematical, right? So
well, I think what Carissa is doing by doing some things like using Python
right.
Can give you a lot of understanding
Yes.
of what these would look like.
Yes. And also,
Oh, I was just going to say something interesting about what you mentioned with the idea of adding one edge to a graph. That almost makes it seem like there's sort of somewhere there should be a backwards version of the graph partitioning problem that's like the optimal brokerage problem, right? Where do you put a broker to make the system
more efficient.
More efficient.
Yeah, and I get that. I think that'd be interesting.
Oh.
That's the reason I say that it's a lot like Mark's Newman's study of communities.
Mm-hmm.
How do you change the community if you add one additional edge?
Any more questions or thoughts?
Yeah, so for different level of hierarchy, do you need a different type of agent, or you only need one? Like you have different blocks.
Yes.
So for different level of hierarchy.
I think it depends on the system. I wouldn't know. I mean, it depends. It depends on.
When you say
I think
different,
yeah.
what are you thinking?
every broker will be different depending on where it's situated in the hierarchy. Yeah, I think so. I think intuitively I would seem so. Because it would have to satisfy the conditions of the parent earn that it's situated in, which would make it subtly different than a broker earn that's a level up or a level down. And maybe I'm wrong in saying that so quickly. But to me, it would seem there'd probably be like a subtle difference that would make it a broker for that particular level versus a broker for a different level. Unless it's more of a generalist broker, in which I gotta think about that.
Is this like your garbage collector?
Yeah, it might be more like
And for the, there's some graph that you show that there's a broker in two different groups.
Yes.
Is there a possibility that the broker, like there will be one broker that will be 20 instead of two?
It's the same broker. Yeah, it's just I have it. Yeah, it's the same.